Hi, welcome to our second lecture of the week, and today we're going to be talking about gun ownership and gun violence in the USA. So here's our agenda. We're going to begin by just looking at what is gun culture? What do we even mean when we say that, and what are some of the contours of it? And then we're going to, as usual, go back to the founding era and look at the Second Amendment, which I'm sure most of you know is the primary reason why we have such a culture of gun ownership in the United States. Although also find out that it's a lot more complicated than that. And then we're just going to visit some important moments in history when the meaning of gun ownership kind of changed. Again, changed in kind of surprising ways. We're going to look at the Reconstruction era and the disarming of Black America, which is something that happened after the Civil War. And then we're going to look at the Western frontier. So we've already talked about westward expansion and the Indian Wars and all those kinds of things. However, one of the big goals today is just understand, like, why does America love guns so much? And I think the myth of the Western frontier, and I'll explain what I mean by myth. I'm not saying it didn't happen, but the myths and the stories that came out of the experience of moving westward in the Wild West and all that stuff, I think really uniquely and powerfully shaped American culture, and in a lot of ways, but gun culture in particular. So that's what we're going to look at. And then we're going to look at some things that have happened, relatively recently within the past 60 years or so. And I'm calling this section the NRA and District of Columbia versus Heller, which, again, hopefully, you know, by the way, it's stylized with the italics and the V, that this is a really consequential Supreme Court decision that came out in 2008 that really gave us the culture that we have today in a lot of ways around guns.
Now, before beginning, I want to present some survey data with you. One of the questions I asked you in your survey was, did you grow up around guns? Most of you said no, about 19% said yes, and about 10%, which in this context is like two people, basically said it's complicated. So, for example, a few people said, like, no, I didn't grow up around guns, but kind of the discourse in my family were that guns were not an inherently bad thing. Now, kind of shoving everything into a yes, no, or kind of framework doesn't really capture the full complexity of the answers you gave. So let me just highlight a few answers that I thought were interesting, just to capture the range of responses and experiences we have in this class. One person said I was raised to not fear guns but respect them. Many of my family members are hunters and ex-military. My family values small private gun ownership, even if they do not own anything. So in other words, this is kind of the it's complicated. Like I didn't personally have a gun, but like people around me did, and my family values guns even if we don't have one. One person said I did not, but I did grow up in a violent area where police could care less about your well-being, and protection, alongside justice, is little to non-existent. Um, and It's some really interesting responses from people who were not born in the United States. I grew up in Germany, and private gun ownership has never been a topic in my environment because I believe that German society in general and the law is very distant towards that topic. Guns were always viewed as the worst thing one could own. Wow. Again, very, very different context. Me and my friends never even thought about getting one. My family came from El Salvador and lived through a 12-year civil war. They had guns for protection because of the state of the country. However, they came to the United States because they didn't want their family to need to hold a gun and wanted to live in peace. So again, a lot of interesting experiences that we're all bringing to this class. And again, regardless of how you grew up and your view on guns, I hope today's lecture will be enlightening.
So here's our big idea for the day. Violence and gun ownership are deeply embedded and intertwined traditions in American history. For many, gun ownership is not just a hobby, it is a deeply felt matter of personal and political identity. This really is my goal today. My goal is not to tell you what you should think about guns or whether you should be for or against guns or whatever. My goal is to just help explain. America loves guns. And America, again, like so many other issues, is wildly different from, other nations like ourselves, Canada, Germany, France, etc., in our love of guns. So why? I think this is one of the reasons why. It is a deeply matter of personal and political identity. So you might be looking at this picture on the left and you're absolutely horrified. And although this level of gun ownership is very unusual, even for people who really love guns, this picture, I think, really captures the degree to which, for a lot of Americans, owning a gun is not just a hobby, it's not just something they do. It is deeply tied to their identity as Americans. And that's hopefully what we're going to try to explore and understand today, regardless of your views on guns and gun control. On the next slide, I just have some pictures I found from the internet that I think demonstrate and capture some of the nuances of a lot of Americans' love and passion for guns. So for some people, again, the Second Amendment in their minds is one of the most important things the founders ever did. And in their view, the Second Amendment protects a right to privately own a gun in your home. And again, for a lot of Americans, they view this as a basic and central right and a distinctive mark of what it means to be an American, right? Your right to protect your family in your home is a deeply felt value for a lot of people. And then on the more extreme end, there are people who believe that owning a gun is the best check against government tyranny, right? Why would anybody want to own a semi-automatic assault rifle whose only purpose is to kill lots of people? Well, for some Americans, they believe that the founders wrote it into the Constitution in the Second Amendment that people should have the right to defend themselves against a tyrannical government. And whether or not that's true, we'll find out soon. But just the point is, this is some example of how deeply passionate some people about guns. And again, there's just a very large and influential and powerful culture of gun ownership in the United States. And it's not just limited to one particular race of people, right? There are people of all different political persuasions and colors and creeds who love guns in America. So let's unpack this a little bit more and just sketch out kind of the broad contours of gun culture. And I think I want to start with this question, which might be an obvious question, but I think it's actually more complex than you realize. Why do Americans own guns? I'm just going to sketch out the top 5 reasons why Americans own guns. So reason number 1 is for work. There are some people who work in law enforcement or, for FBI or whatever, who have to carry a gun for work, and many of them continue to carry a gun when they're off duty, right? So that's one of the reasons why a lot of Americans own guns, is because a lot of Americans are in jobs that require guns. A lot of Americans own guns for sporting, right? So hunting, and then also, people who do like target practice or trap shooting, which is like people shooting these like clay pigeons that get shot out of these little machines. One of the ways that guns have intersected with my life, someone who grew up in a home where hunting was a big deal. I went hunting several times and shot guns in the woods and stuff. So for a lot of people, it's a really important cultural tradition. Personal protection. So here we're getting into more kind of controversial territory. A lot of people feel like, well, there's tons of guns in this society, and the only way for me to protect myself and my family from, quote unquote, bad guys with guns is to be a good guy with a gun. So a lot of people have guns. Why? Because other people have guns. So we need to protect ourselves from those people. Personal identity and exercise of rights. So again, here is really, we're getting to this whole gun culture thing, right? For a lot of Americans, owning guns that look like this, whose only purpose and application really is to kill large numbers of people, is a deeply held part of their identity, right? What does it mean to be an American? American is someone who has freedoms and rights and exercises those freedoms and rights whenever and wherever they want to. And for a lot of people who own guns, this is one of the most kind of powerful and important application of that, just in terms of their lifestyle and their kind of ideologies and the way they view themselves in the larger world. And then this is probably the most controversial on this list, a check on government tyranny. And we're going to unpack this a little later on. But again, there are lots of people, particularly on kind of the, I guess you call it kind of the hard or extreme right, who believe that at any moment, the federal government could get tyrannical and try to oppress us. And the only way to stop that is to have a well-armed American citizenry. So this is gun culture. So gun culture is a broad term applied to the attitudes and behaviors of those who identify deeply with gun ownership. It's a basic feature of American identity. Now, I did want to mention your talkback. So quick refresher, the talkback was a podcast basically arguing that in certain sectors of American society, particularly in the American South and in also often minoritized communities, there is a deep sense of kind of honor culture, right? This idea that if somebody disrespects you, you have to step up and defend yourself so that other people don't come along and take advantage of you later on. And although I don't think gun culture comes directly out of honor culture, I think there are a lot of reasons why we have a gun culture in the United States. However, I think this is a really important component of it. Now, I'm not going to lecture on it because I think the podcast did a good job of kind of detailing that. But I think for our purposes today, one of the most important points in the podcast was exploring this whole stand your ground law thing. So I think what I want to do in the next slide is just talk about kind of the current state of specifically self-defense laws, which, self-defense laws are not gun laws, but they kind of indirectly are, right? Because the assumption is, what are you defending yourself with? Well, most people are not defending themselves with knives, right? Most Americans are defending themselves with guns. So let's just kind of take a very, very broad look at the kinds of self-defense gun laws that we have in the United States. So here's a map showing current self-defense laws in the various 50 states. As you can see, most states in the blue have what's called stand your ground laws. A handful of states have duty to retreat laws, and even smaller handful of states have castle doctrine laws. So what does that mean? So in the next slide, I'm going to just broadly define each of these, and from there kind of move on to talking about some of the statistics around gun violence and homicide and suicides with guns and things like that. Because again, in this opening section, we're just trying to get an understanding of what is gun culture and what role are guns playing in the United States right now. U.S. states generally support 3 different types of self-defense laws. So there are federal gun laws. However, there are not that many. And generally speaking, most of the laws in this country are at the state level. And again, because we have this historic system of federalism where the states and the federal government share power, there is a kind of a vast array of different kinds of laws, depending on what state you live in. So let's check this out. So I'm going to start with the kind of self-defense laws that we have in Maryland right now, which is the duty to retreat laws. So 13 means 13 states currently that have them. Duty to retreat laws expect citizens to try to escape before using force against a threat. So again, if you're living in Maryland and you think someone might be threatening you and you have a gun on your person, a legally owned gun on your person, you can't use that gun against the person, legally speaking, unless you've like tried to get away. Now, again, it's like, how do you measure that? I don't know. Like that's one of the problems with all of these laws, right? Is like, how do you judge human intention when you are in these kind of like potentially life or death situations? I don't know, but is what it is. The second category of laws, which are probably the most controversial right now, but also the most widespread, as you can see, 30 states have them, are the stand your ground laws. And these enable citizens to use force without a duty to retreat. Critics call these shoot first laws.
Stand your ground statutes are controversial, and more than half the country has one of those statutes in place. I spoke to experts about the laws and why researchers say they have different implications for people of color. In the span of 1 week, 3 shootings with a similar story. Young people made a mistake. The cases bringing renewed focus to stand your ground laws. Justice! What exactly are stand your ground laws?
Stand your ground statutes really greatly expand your ability to use self-defense.
Cami Chavez is the director of the Center for Criminal Justice Policy and Reform at William & Mary College. She says most states provide some form of protection for self-defense, but at least 28 states and Puerto Rico have enacted stand your ground or similar laws.
Self-defense also imposes a duty to retreat before using force. When we're talking about stand your ground statutes, is that some states have legislation that removes the duty to retreat in all circumstances.
The laws have stirred controversy over the years.
No justice! No peace!
In 2012, the death of Trayvon Martin sparked conversations about stand your ground in Florida, known to have among the strongest statutes in the country. Martin, a 17-year-old unarmed black boy, was fatally shot by George Zimmerman, who later claimed self-defense and was acquitted following a criminal trial. Proponents of these laws, including the National Rifle Association and the Second Amendment Foundation, say they protect citizens when they're in danger.
The oldest human right is the right of self-preservation. You can stand your ground and initiate self-defense protocols however you deem necessary.
They essentially tell people that if you're in public and you feel threatened, you can use deadly force and take another human life, even if you could have retreated.
The Journal of the American Medical Association's 2022 study found stand your ground laws were associated with an 8 to 11% increase in monthly rates of homicide and firearm homicide. But studies show stand your ground outcomes are not the same for all people. In 2020, the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights releasing a report on stand your ground laws in Florida. The study found cases involving a white shooter and black victims were 10 times more likely to be ruled as justified compared to a black shooter and white victims. The study also found the number of homicides of black people deemed justifiable more than doubled in stand your ground states in the 6 years after the law was implemented. In the cases of the 3 young people shot last week, Chavez says, like the laws themselves, the potential outcomes are mixed.
Each case has different facts, and we're also dealing with different statutes.
And it is important to add there have been efforts to change or repeal stand your ground laws, but those statewide repeals have largely been limited.
Type of law is also the least common, and these are castle doctrine laws. Castle doctrine laws allow stand your ground force only while on your private property. So if you're in your house or like if you're in your car, and in some cases, in some states, if you're at work, you are considered on your private property and can use force, even deadly force, if you feel threatened. Now, you might be thinking castle doctrine. Where does that come from? This comes from English common law. So again, English common law is this kind of like boring set of legal statutes that happened centuries and centuries and centuries ago in kind of medieval England. And there are certain aspects of them that continue to today. Because in kind of British common law, there was this phrase that like, every man's home is his castle, right? 'Cause obviously not everybody had a castle. If you're poor, you didn't have a castle. But there's this idea in British common law that if you own your home and someone threatened or attacked you, you had the right to defend yourself and your family. So that is where these laws come from. So they're kind of in between. I feel like the duty to retreat laws are kind of the more kind of quote unquote liberal. Stand your ground is more kind of conservative. And I think castle doctrine is kind of in the middle somewhere. Now, this whole federalism thing, right, the states versus the federal government, means that we kind of have like a patchwork of laws, right? So here's another example of that. Some states allow you to carry a gun, in your pocket or in your holster or whatever, without a permit. Some states do not. It just, again, depends on what state you're living in. So, this creates very uneven experiences across states. Different people have different realities and different kind of laws governing what guns they can have. However, there are all kinds of loopholes. For example, one of the kind of biggest facets of gun culture is gun shows. So, there are several in Maryland every year, like at the Timonium Fairgrounds out north of Towson or whatever. But gun shows are also controversial because, if you're living in the state of Maryland, there are certain laws about when and how you purchase a gun. However, oftentimes those laws don't apply if you're at a gun show. So this is also how people get guns that are not legal in some states. So certain types of large weapons like the AR-15, the one that's often used in mass shootings, is not legal to purchase in the state of Maryland. However, you can just drive down to states where it is legal, purchase one, and just drive back to your house, which is one of the many reasons why there are so many guns in America. Speaking of so many guns in America, here are just some facts and stats to capture this dynamic. So the U.S. has about 370 million residents who collectively own roughly 434 million guns. Now, this stat's 6 months old, so it's probably higher than that. 2020 alone saw 16.5 million legal gun sales. So just wrap your head around this. We have more guns than citizens, which, depending on your political persuasion, is either great or a problem. More stats. 2020 saw roughly 20,000 gun-related deaths, excluding suicides. 2022 saw 646 mass shootings. So a mass shooting is defined as 4 or more people shot in one incident. That is an incredibly huge and high number. While estimates vary, private citizens use guns for self-defense about 70,040 times per year. Now, again, it's hard to say exactly. Like so many things, we have data, and the data is not always perfect. There are gun advocates who would say this number is really low and this number is manufactured to downplay the amount of times people use self-defense. But based on my research, I think this number is fairly accurate, about as accurate as we can possibly get. One last point: men who own handguns are 8 times more likely to die of gun suicides than men who don't. So again, here is just some numbers showing the complexity of gun ownership, and some might say the problem with guns, again, depending on your politics, in the United States. And like so many issues we've talked about in this class, whether it's religion, whether it's what race, whether it's whatever, the United States is very much an outlier in the world. And here are some stats to capture this. So this is showing, let me disappear, countries with the highest number of civilian firearms per 100 residents. You can see the second highest is Yemen, and we far outstrip Yemen by double, of what the next highest has. So long story short, America has a lot of guns, and we are an outlier in that. And here we also have a lot of gun homicides, right? So this is showing rates of firearm homicides, so that's murder, right, per 100,000 population, and the United States far outstrips any other country on planet Earth.
We need rescue inside the auditorium, multiple victims.
The United States has a problem with gun violence.
We hold the victims in our hearts.
Perhaps we may never fully understand it.
A man with a semi-automatic weapon.
We talk about it after mass shootings, but it's much larger and more complicated than those debates allow.
That is not accurate.
Here's what you need to know about the state of gun violence in America. It's true that the U.S. sees many more mass shootings than these other developed countries. Between 2000 and 2014, there were 133 mass shootings in public populated places. That's excluding gang violence and terrorism. Of course, the U.S. is a much larger country, but if you adjust for population size, it still ranks higher. Of these countries, Finland is next, with just 2 shootings over 14 years, but a much, much smaller population. And this type of tragedy seems to be happening more often in the U.S. Each of these squares represents a public mass shooting with 4 or more fatalities. Before 2011, they happened 6 months apart on average. But since then, only 2 months go by between them.
I hope and pray that I don't have to come out again during my tenure as president to offer my condolences to families in these circumstances.
That was October 1st, 2015. And just about 2 months later,
yesterday, a tragedy occurred in San Bernardino, and our first order of business is to send our thoughts and prayers to the families of those who've been killed
Public mass shootings get all the attention because they're often so indiscriminate. But the truth is, mass shootings are unlike most gun deaths in America. Here's how it breaks down. According to the most recent data, 92 people are killed with guns every day on average. About 30 of those are homicides, of which maybe 1.5 at most can be considered part of mass shootings. Most of those killed, 58 people a day, are suicides. The rest are accidental shootings, police actions, and undetermined incidents. Those suicides, they show up in international comparisons too. These are the 10 countries ranked highest on human development by the UN. The US has the highest suicide rate among them, and this darker bar shows how many of those are with guns. Some people think suicide isn't really relevant to the gun issue.
But to go and think that some type of gun control regulations that are being talked about are going to stop somebody from committing suicide when there's so many other ways for people to commit suicide.
But the methods that people use are important because suicide attempts often stem from temporary crises. The vast majority of people who survive suicide attempts don't end up dying from suicide, but guns make it nearly impossible to get that second chance. The victims of gun suicides are overwhelmingly men and mostly white. And the rate of gun suicides has been increasing in the US. At the same time, the rate of gun homicides has been decreasing, especially since the 90s when crime rates in general were higher. But if you compare the US to other developed countries, it doesn't look like good news. These are homicides adjusted for population size. The US would probably have a higher homicide rate even without guns, but you can see how gun violence pushes that rate far beyond the other countries here. The victims of these shootings, they're not the ones you often see on the national news. They're disproportionately young black men.
You guys can leave here and go on with your lives, but we gotta go home to empty rooms because our children's lives were taken away by people who should not have had guns anyway.
One possible explanation is that the US simply has more crime than those other countries. But if you set aside homicides for a moment and look at rates of burglary or assault, you don't see that same spike that you see with homicide. It's not that America has much more crime. It's that crime in the US is much more lethal. Altogether, the number of gun deaths in the US from 2000 to 2013 exceeds the number of Americans killed by AIDS, by illegal drug overdoses, the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, and terrorism combined. It should be clear by now that this level of gun violence is a uniquely American problem among the developed world.
So, there is something to guns in America that is just really unique and significant in understanding American identity. To kind of further this discussion, I'm going to pause here and play a little video. This is a really interesting video. It's actually by like Turkish public television, which I find that sometimes people from other countries are able to be kind of analytical and critical about American culture in a way sometimes we as Americans are not. So I'm going to play a good chunk of this video because, again, I think it'll do a good job of kind of demonstrating, from the mouths of people who really, really, really care a lot about guns, why they love guns so much, what role guns play in their lives. Right? Check it out.
Mississippi, the heart of America. It was one of the final stops of the 1961 civil rights freedom ride against segregation. Much of the state is made up of small rural communities struggling to survive. After slavery was abolished, jobs in the cotton fields were replaced by industrial work in factories. But these days, that is scarce.
One person is dead, 5 others are injured after a shooting with multiple shooters at a street festival in Mississippi.
Now to the deadly shooting spree shattering the holiday weekend in Mississippi. Police say at least 8 people were killed in several locations.
It apparently started as a family dispute and ended with 8 people dead, including 2 boys.
2 Walmart employees are dead after a disgruntled former employee opened fire in the South Haven store.
At least 7 people left injured after a mass shooting at a Mississippi nightclub.
Mississippi is now the poorest state in America. It also has some of the most lenient gun laws and one of the highest death rates in the country. Mississippi does not require that a person pass a criminal background check before buying a firearm from an unlicensed seller, nor does the state require a person obtain a permit for a gun.
In 1980, I lost my 25-year-old mother, Sharon Neal, to an act of domestic violence that involved a gun. And the person who took her life stole her from us, my 3 brothers and I. And, that traumatizes you forever.
Lorenzo Neal is a pastor at a church in Jackson, Mississippi. He calls himself a gun violence prevention advocate. Places of worship have long been seen as a target for gun violence since the attack in South Carolina in 2015. 21-year-old white supremacist Dylan Roof opened fire at the Charleston church, killing 9 people.
The biggest push for me to get involved was in 2015, after the shooting at Emmanuel AME Church, her mother Emmanuel AME Church in Charleston, South Carolina. The pastor is a colleague of mine, brother in ministry, and he and 8 others lost their lives. There are so many more like myself who've been impacted by gun violence, who are still grieving, still traumatized, whether they lost someone because through gun homicide, or they lost someone through gun suicide, or they lost a child through an unintentional shooting. Those stories sometimes get lost in the headlines and definitely lost in statistics.
Pastor Neal says that there is an epidemic of gun violence in America, and he feels it is his role to do something. So it is surprising to me that the pastor himself owns a gun.
More than one, a couple actually, yeah.
So please explain it for me. You are against gun violence, but you possess several guns. So in America, it's not about being for or against guns, I guess, right?
Yes, it's not about that. And I think the narrative, you hear the word gun control. I do not like that because it gives off this very, very vague sentiment. We need to control guns. What do you mean by control guns? Most people are responsible gun owners. We pass legislation to ensure that persons who want to be responsible gun owners can do so. We've got that on the books, The problem is keeping hands out of the persons who should not have them, keeping guns out of the hands of persons who should not have them.
But when a kid comes up to you and says that he's scared of guns, and if he were to know that you own guns yourself, what would you say to that kid? How would you explain that?
Same way my grandfather explained to me. There's nothing wrong with the gun itself if you're responsible. You have to, it's about education from the jump. You don't disenfranchise gun ownership because of gun violence.
Lorenzo's argument, which seems distinctly American to me, is that it's not guns that are the problem, it's the people carrying them. So I feel like it's only fair if I explore this point more. And what better place to do that than at a gun range?
My name's Chuck Boyer, and I'm an instructor here at the range by Jimmy Primo's. Always be sure of your target and what's behind it, because a 9mm pistol will shoot through a wall and hit an unintended target on the other side. This hand goes right here, up against this hand, and goes in this on this side of the grip of the gun.
So the two hands
Yeah,
merge here.
in this, and then you put pressure with this hand and like this.
When someone buys a gun from here, let's say that they're not well trained, but they like end up in a situation where they have to defend themselves. Like, how much of a training should a person need before they go on the street
It depends on the individual person. We encourage them to come in and shoot a box of shells, 50 rounds, 100 rounds, at least once a month.
Not only in Mississippi, but also across the country, there's not a restriction as to how much well trained you have to be before you can possess a gun, right?
No, I'm not aware. I'm not aware. I mean, it's just like no different than getting a driver's license.
After the safety demonstration, Chuck is showing me how to handle a firearm.
Fingers here, put the sights on the target, take the slack out, press. Okay, you've got a loaded gun on the table. I hit the target.
No nation has embraced the firearm like the United States. Nearly half of all civilian-owned guns in the world belong to Americans. The Second Amendment, the right to bear arms, is seen as a fundamental right which, for many, can't be questioned. But the widespread availability of guns comes at a cost. There hasn't been a single week in the US in 2022 without a mass shooting, where 4 or more people are injured or killed.
It was considered an unalienable right that was created up under the Articles of Confederation when this country was first created. And it also goes back to the fact that before even it was made a constitutional right, that Americans own guns for protection.
I've come to meet Larry McLooney, who lives in Greenwood, Mississippi. He's an historian and teacher in the region, who has also offended many by publicly defending the Confederate flag. What played the biggest role in the way that you're looking at American history, the way you've been looking at it?
Of course, I have to say, for me, it would be the war between the states, as they teach in public school, the Civil War, because the United States was not a unified country until after that war. The country, the colonies were all frontier, and very little law. And it was up to the citizens at that time to defend themselves, to enforce the law, and protect themselves from the Indians, to also provide food, hunting. Guns were in short supply. So when you acquire one of these weapons, it becomes very personal. It's not only providing food for the family, but also provides safety for your family and helps enforce the laws.
As we are in Mississippi, a New York gun law is struck down by the US Supreme Court that placed restrictions on carrying a concealed handgun outside the home. It's the widest expansion of gun rights in a decade. How can you stop someone, let's say a 19, 20-year-old morally declining man or a woman, from legally acquiring a weapon, an assault rifle, and go on a killing spree in Mississippi?
I don't see where you can legally. If a person wants to buy a gun, they're going to buy a gun, even in Europe.
But I can't show off with my weapon in Berlin.
No.
Or I can't show off with my massive rifle in London.
Right.
Why should I be able to show off with my weapon in Jackson or Greenwood?
Well, it's the right of the American citizens. I mean, the right, according to 21st century interpretation of the Constitution, to bear arms.
Militia groups have been making a resurgence over the last few years, and whether they are left or right-wing, they all share a love of guns. My final stop is Brookhaven, Mississippi, to meet members of a gun club who have traveled here from Texas.
They talk about how trusting the justice system. Well, the justice system needs to do its job. Black power?
Black power! The black militia have gathered in front of the courthouse as they've just gone in to speak with the district attorney because they want to apply some pressure as a young black teenager boy was chased and shot at in January by 2 white people. So they are here with their semi-automatic rifles to protest.
For over 400 years, suffered at the hands of white supremacy. One of the original laws that were passed here in the United States, before it was even states, when they were just colonies, was that black people couldn't own firearms. And they did that intentionally so we couldn't revolt, uprise, and be free. See, the Second Amendment is to protect the First Amendment, but you have to remember, our ancestors didn't have those rights, but we do now. And so you're not gonna just brutalize us and just think it's okay. Those days are over. And we'll go as many places as we have to get the message out. So yes, we're out here with rifles, but I bet you won't see anybody out here getting brutalized.
Both the white people and the black people, it could turn into, it could have a spillover effect, and it could turn into, shootouts on the streets between the two communities.
Well, what's the alternative? Buffalo. The alternative is Buffalo. If we don't arm ourselves, they'll slaughter us. Those white supremacists, we know. Look at South Carolina in the church. Look at Buffalo. I mean, the list goes on. Like, how many times do we have to get slaughtered for people to understand nobody's coming to save us?
First section kind of gave us the what, right? What is American gun culture? Where are all these guns? Why do people have them? And why do people love them? And now we're going to get to the why. To answer that question, we have to look at the Second Amendment. Because today, people who love guns and are very passionate about owning guns and defending their right to have guns often point to the Second Amendment. So let's look at it. What did it actually say? What did it actually mean? Today, when we talk about the Second Amendment, again, whether you're strongly for, strongly against, or somewhere in the middle, we tend to couch it in this rhetoric, right? Gun rights versus gun control. However, you might be surprised to learn that when we talk about the Second Amendment in this way, it would baffle the founders. The gun rights versus gun control debate does not comport with the founders' concerns, right? So in other words, when the founders wrote the Second Amendment, this was just not something, this was like not even on the table. This, like guns were not the issue and the controversial problem in society then that they are now. The average American had a completely different relationship to guns than the ones that we have today. So what was the context? I'm going to start with a video that'll kind of outline some of the larger points I'm going to be making, and then I'm going to kind of slow walk you through the argument and give you some historical data to kind of back up this argument, and also some notes to get in case you're taking notes.
Gun ownership has been intertwined with the identity of America since the settlement of the 13 colonies. The Second Amendment to the U.S. Constitution guarantees Americans' right to keep and bear arms. But this simple phrase has led to decades of debate around gun control legislation and limitations on gun ownership, arguments that have gone all the way up to the Supreme Court. But to understand why the Second Amendment has provoked so much debate, we have to go back to the earliest days of the United States. At the time the Founding Fathers began drafting the Constitution, there were two major political groups, the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. Federalists believed in a strong central government. The Anti-Federalists, fearing monarchy and tyranny, favored strong state governments. This debate also spread to the young country's military. Federalists believed a strong standing army was necessary to defend against foreign attacks and large-scale domestic unrest. Anti-Federalists believed those attacks could be prevented by states' militias, who could be called upon in a time of national crisis. They were weary of large military forces. Having experienced the oppression of the British Army both before and during the Revolution, this was a time when gun ownership and self-armament were already well established in the soon-to-be United States. Half of American colonists owned guns by 1775. More Americans had guns in their homes than had chairs or books. They had experienced British attempts to control through disarmament. But guns weren't just about protecting citizens from tyranny. Guns reinforced domain over property, and in the South, property meant slaves. Slave owners had a higher rate of gun ownership, and Southern militias focused less on protecting against the government's use of the military to oppress them and more on keeping slaves from fleeing their masters or from outright rebellion. James Madison, a slave owner from Virginia, had all of these groups in mind: Federalists, Anti-Federalists, militias in the North and South, when he drafted the Second Amendment. The Constitution allowed for the raising of a federal army, but the Second Amendment was introduced as a compromise to make sure that this federal army was not going to be turned against the citizenry, striking a balance of power between the states and the federal government. At the time, the Second Amendment was not primarily seen as an individual's right to bear arms for their own protection, but rather, as the writings of colonial thinkers like Noah Webster and Alexander Hamilton suggest, it was about enabling citizens to be part of a collective militia that would avert the use of the nation's military at home. Gun ownership evolved as the country expanded, and differing interpretations of the Second Amendment have developed over time. The Supreme Court has heard many cases involving the Second Amendment, but never established gun ownership as a personal right outside of the context of some sort of military service. That is, until 2008, with the case of the District of Columbia v. Heller. Dick Heller was a D.C. cop who applied for permission to keep his sidearm at home, but because the city had enacted a handgun ban, his permit was denied. The court ruled in favor of Heller that the D.C. handgun ban was in violation of the Second Amendment. In his majority opinion, Justice Antonin Scalia wrote that the Second Amendment guaranteed an individual right to possess and carry weapons in case of confrontation. The court did acknowledge some limits, such as firearm possession by felons or in places such as schools or government buildings. This was considered a departure from legal precedent, which had largely derived people's right to bear arms in the context of a militia. The Heller decision was a huge moment in the gun rights debate, as gun violence continues to plague the nation. Some believe that an armed citizenry is safer. Others believe more guns directly lead to more violence. However you see the issue, most can agree that debate surrounding the Second Amendment will continue to rage on.
So in early colonial America, men were expected and sometimes legally required, again, depended on the colony, because each colony had their own rules and laws, to keep a gun in their home, attend regular firearm training, and be ready to organize to defend their community. This was the militia, right? So in other words, there were no cops back then. England had a full-time military, but like England was far away. So how are we going to protect ourselves if something jumps off? Well, the militia. And right away, again, in the Second Amendment to the Constitution, this tradition was enshrined in our founding documents. So let's read the Second Amendment. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Now, notice there's some commas in here, and you might be like, I don't care about commas, but like the placement of these commas, there's literally like entire philosophies and theories of how to interpret the Second Amendment based on these commas. So what does it actually mean in its original context? Well, let's keep looking at the militia, I think, is the best way to answer that question. So in pretty much all the colonies, able-bodied men had to have a gun and show up for regular trainings on a regular basis. Well, why is that? Well, because of things like uprisings or revolts or riots, right? There was no cops. So this was the next best thing. Also slave revolts, this is part of our history. It's ugly, but it's there. Putting down slave revolts was a significant reason why a lot of colonies wanted to have and supported militias, and also Native American attacks. Now, especially for people living kind of out on the frontier regions of various colonies, were often subjected to Native American attacks, which again is a long history we've already talked about, so we're not going to say which side was right and which side was wrong. But regardless, in the minds of the colonists, this was a real danger, and the best way to protect against this was the militia. I think this is a really fascinating point, because this is not how a lot of Americans think today, but the founders deeply feared a standing army, right? So you might ask, well, instead of this whole militia thing, why don't they just have a professional military? Well, they feared a standing army. That was like the last thing they wanted. Well, why? Well, they just fought the British Army, which was an institution controlled by the king, and they equated standing armies with tyranny. So this is what I mean, like why it's so important putting things in context. Like this is not like a thought that almost anybody, except for maybe like extreme left-wing people, have today, right? This idea of like, we should not have a federal military because that's tyrannical is so foreign to how we think today. So the solution was civilian control. Now, there are people today who think a full-time federal army is a problem and who are very, very, very critical of the U.S. militaries. And they're both people on the left and people on the right. For example, here's an article, and I don't have a date on this. It came out a few years ago, I believe, like an opinion piece on a website called The American Conservative by an author who's arguing that, kind of like arguing against the grain of how most conservatives and just Americans in general think that having this enormous military is actually like a threat to our freedom instead of a protector of our freedom. Again, this is a minority viewpoint. But it is an unsurprising viewpoint given the size of the United States military. We have the third largest military in the world, and I believe we have the largest military presence, meaning our military is just in more countries around the world than any other military. So even though we don't have the largest in terms of numbers, we do have, I think, the largest in terms of our influence around the world. So the founders would have been horrified at this, but that was a long time ago. Lots changed since then. So because they feared kind of this, out of control monarch ruling or running the military, the Constitution puts the president, who is an elected citizen, in charge of the military. So to this day, whoever's president at the time is the commander-in-chief of the military. Well, why? Well, because the Constitution says so. Why? Well, because the founders did not want, a kind of like militaristic autocrat in charge of the military. They wanted an elected official who kind of, gets cycled out every 4 to 8 years, right? Back then, the military was understood as a collection of local and state militias around the country. So in early America, they did not have a military as we would define it. Their military, again, was militias, was this kind of like large collection of everyday citizens who were being trained to kind of keep order in their communities and called out in case something needed to happen. And here is a kind of artifact from that era. So this is from 1820, so we're skipping ahead a little bit, but basically like militias in the United States were kind of a thing until pretty much early 20th century. So this is from Maine, right, state of Maine, and it says looks like Alexander Houston, you being duly enrolled as a soldier in the company of which Captain John McKean is commanding officer, are hereby ordered to appear at James McCrillis's house on Tuesday, the 10th day of October at 6 o'clock in the forenoon, armed and equipped as the law directs for military duty and inspection, and there wait further orders. By order of said commanding officer, blah, blah, blah. So again, if you were an able-bodied man back then, you were part of the militia, whether you wanted to be or not. And again, according to this, there was a law in the state of Maine as late as 1820, basically demanding that if you're an able-bodied man, you have a gun in your home, and if you have a gun in your home, you got to show up for military duty. Which, I mean, this is so, like today, the U.S. military does not say like, hey, everybody meet at somebody's house so we can do target practice, right? This is so foreign and different from what we're used to. But that was the militia, right? This was their military, again, pretty much until the early 20th century. The Second Amendment was conceived as a civic right and obligation. So important. Civic right and obligation, not an individual right. Male citizens were expected to bear arms in times of unrest or attack. There was a historian who did an analysis of the term bear arms. He looked at hundreds and hundreds of old newspaper articles and old government documents. And I think he said something like 95% of every time the word bear arms appears in colonial and early American writing, it's always talking about the militia. It's almost never talking about the individual right to bear arms. Point number two, conversely, the amendment prevents the federal government from disarming state militias. And you're like, what does that mean? So again, part of doing history is like putting yourself in a mindset that we don't have. Think back to what the founders were dealing with, right? They just fought a war against a government that they viewed as tyrannical. They didn't want to centralize too much power in any one sector of government. So one of the ways they balanced things was by basically saying, the states can run the militias and the federal government can't kind of dictate or control what the militias could do, right? Which is essentially what it's saying, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed, right? Because again, remember, the first 10 amendments only applied to the federal government. They didn't apply to the states. So basically what this is saying is militias are, it's almost making an argument militias are part of our culture. This is how we defend ourselves. And the federal government, in this interpretation, which I think is the correct interpretation of the Second Amendment, the federal government cannot disarm the militias, right? That right of the states to bear arms shall not be infringed. This was not an individual right to own guns for personal use, like hunting and self-defense. Overwhelmingly, historians who have looked at this, I think, honestly, without a political agenda to force a particular view on kind of modern gun debates, have said this is what the Second Amendment meant originally. So the question is then, what about private gun rights, right? Was there a culture of private gun ownership in early America? The answer is yes, there was. The issue of owning a weapon for private use simply did not factor into the debates over ratifying the Constitution, right? So again, there's just no evidence that when the founders were crafting this language and debating it and disagreeing over it, that it was about private gun ownership. Issues like hunting rights and self-defense were seen as natural rights governed by common law, not civic rights needing federal protection. So yes, there was a lot of private gun ownership as well, right? Especially if you're living in like a frontier part of early America, you need your gun, to feed your family and to protect yourself and things like that. However, when the Second Amendment was written, this is not what they were talking about, right? So this is, again, why this stuff is so complicated, because sometimes people who argue for a more individualistic interpretation of the Second Amendment will say, well, look at all the guns everybody owned. Well, yeah, people own a lot of guns because people own a lot of guns. It doesn't necessarily mean, just because people own a lot of guns doesn't necessarily mean the Second Amendment was about private gun ownership. And again, the evidence shows that it was not. However, almost immediately, Americans started disagreeing over how to apply the Second Amendment. However, the main issue was about control of the militia. No one in that day believed that the Second Amendment protected an individual right to private gun ownership. So one of the themes that's come up several times in this class is that the founders crafted ambiguous language and often disagreed on what it meant and or how to apply that, right? And the Second Amendment's a good example. People disagreed over what the Second Amendment meant. However, they did not disagree over whether the Second Amendment was about an individual right to bear arms or a civic duty. What they did argue over was this. Now, notice there's a blue star here. This is important for your notes. The next 2 points on this slide are not important for your notes. So again, you can write them down as always if you want to, but this next part I think is a little granular and won't be on the exam, but I think for our purposes, it is important. So that point is this. The writers of the Bill of Rights, who were Federalists, and I'll explain all this in a second, wanted the national government to control local and state militias. Anti-Federalists valued states' rights and wanted local control of militias. And this is what the founders fought over. Again, the founders did not fight over, is this about individual rights or a civic collective duty? They argued over how the language in the Second Amendment should apply, right? So should the states be primarily and even like sovereignly, in control of the militias, or should the federal government be overwhelmingly in control of the militias? And this is what they debated. And generally speaking, the second view won out via a series of laws passed by Congress. So let me just, this is probably stuff you might have learned in like middle school or whatever, but just very, very, very briefly. When the Constitution was being written and argued over and ratified, there were, broadly speaking, two groups. One group was the Federalists, who wanted a strong central government and weaker states' rights, and the Anti-Federalists wanted a weak central government and stronger states' rights. On this particular issue, on the issue of who should control the militias, over time, and this is, by over time, I mean like through laws passed by Congress, as well as some early Supreme Court decisions, Anti-Federalists generally won out. So by the time we get to, the 1810s, 1820s, the federal government in general was not regulating or overseeing militias for the most part. Each individual states had its own laws, but each individual state had its own militias, which again was their military, which was the dominant understanding of what the Second Amendment meant at that time. One more point, which is going to feel kind of wonky, but is actually, I think, really important for understanding contemporary gun culture in America. Some anti-federalists viewed the state militias as a check on potential federal tyranny, arguing for a right to resistance if the government exceeded its authorities. Let me pause there again. So this is more evidence that people disagreed over how to apply the Second Amendment in the early American context. More Federalists would say, it's never okay for people to rise up and attack the government because, right, we just already did that and we have a new government trying to get it to work. However, Anti-Federalists, who again favored states' rights more, I guess we could say we call them more kind of conservatives, viewed state militias as like a check and balance, right? So what if the federal government got tyrannical? Well, we have the militias to kind of deal with that problem if we need to have another revolution, right? However, this view was largely tested and disfavored as a series of armed rebellions over the subsequent years were crushed by militias with little public outcry. I'll give you an example of that shortly. However, this view that the Second Amendment outlines a right for citizens to violently resist a tyrannical government remains popular today. Let me give you some examples of that. These are just kind of some memes I found online and whatnot, demonstrating this view. If you look at kind of pro-Trump or some kind of like a lot of right-wing protests today, you'll often see images like this. Come and take it. Well, what's that about? Well, it's about stopping tyranny. There is a view, again, a view that developed very early on in kind of the early decades after the ratification of the Constitution, that the Second Amendment essentially outlines a right for people to rebel against and fight and overturn the federal government if the federal government gets tyrannical. And this is one of the reasons, again, why a lot of people on the right say we should be able to own AR-15s because we need them, right? Well, why? Well, to kind of keep the federal government from being tyrannical. Here's another meme, and this one I've kind of broken up into chunks so we can kind of see the argument. Again, I'm neither endorsing nor opposing this argument. I'm just trying to get us to understand how things that happened in the founding era still shape today. So here's another kind of pro-gun meme. It's kind of set up as like a conversation between the anti-gun and a pro-gun person. Why do you need a gun like an AR-15? Again, AR-15 is a kind of, semi-automatic rifle that is one of the more popular guns for mass shooters, to be blunt. So why do you need a gun like an AR-15? It's not about need. It is my Second Amendment right to own such a rifle. But assault weapons aren't necessary for hunting. First of all, it's not an assault weapon. So there's some like semantic debate over what an assault weapon is or is not. I think it's kind of not really important for our purposes today. But this is a more important point. And secondly, the Second Amendment isn't about hunting. It is about defending liberty from tyranny. Now, again, this was not the dominant view in early America, but this was a view that some people had. So you're worried that a tyrant is going to take away your guns and your liberty. No, actually, I'm not, because we have the Second Amendment, right? So it's kind of this like circular argument, right? The reason in this view why we have the Second Amendment is to protect, so that ordinary citizens can own huge numbers of guns to protect themselves in case the government gets tyrannical. And because we have huge numbers of guns in America, the government probably won't get tyrannical, according to this view. Now, more connections between the past and the present. Today in America, and this kind of started, I believe, in the 1980s, but today in America, there is a large kind of national network of these small groups of armed private citizens who consider themselves modern militias, right? In the minds of the people who participate in and support this movement, they view this as a kind of direct lineage, or even maybe like a resurrection or a resuscitation of this early American tradition, right? Of private citizens getting together, arming themselves, practicing together, and kind of, again, creating these networks and these groups so that if and when something jumps off, they can respond. And I think today, also, if the federal government becomes tyrannical, these militias, or at least tyrannical in the minds of the people who are participating in these movements, it is their right and their duty to resist and try to stop and even overthrow the federal government if and when such a case arises. Here's a little video about that.
Militia are controversial groups that were out in force over the past year, patrolling both right and left-wing rallies and protests, and they rarely give an inside view of their organizations. Fox 43's Harry Lee embedded with one Pennsylvania-based militia during a training to find out who they are and what they stand for.
The newly formed Pennsylvania Volunteer Militia agreed to include us in their first official training held in West Central Pennsylvania. They say they have a new vision for militia groups. All week, we'll be taking an honest look at the militia movement as a whole and whether groups like this can fit in it. The first meeting of the Pennsylvania Volunteer Militia drew only 6 men, all Old Guard members of now disbanded groups.
It was just build, make it big, burn it down. Build, make it big, burn it down, build, make it big, burn it down. And that's kind of where we're at today.
You're letting him know you're moving. Yeah. Okay, because right now he can't see you.
It's the 6th time Christian Yingling is starting from the beginning. Over 12 years, the 48-year-old from the Pittsburgh area led a group called the Westmoreland County Regulators, followed by 4 iterations of the Pennsylvania Lightfoot Militia.
They're not going to be able to move until they at least break to that blue barrel.
This time around, he's setting the agenda.
We do tactical training. We wear camouflage. We carry guns, absolutely. But that's not all we do. You know, we want to do community service stuff, help out at food banks, you know, go help clean up a playground.
They train for different situations, though most involve government overreach.
The United States government has mandated that it is 100% mandatory to get the COVID vaccination. The government is never going to look at us in a favorable light because we are, in my opinion, always going to be a threat to them. Not necessarily in the fact that, you know, we're in a militia, but in the fact that our militia is like, militia, other militias out there are the first ones to stand up when there's constitutional violations taking place. We're the first ones to step up. Whoa, 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 hey, whoa, time out, slow down.
All they say to protect you.
We're helping the community, but we're armed.
It's a new vision of what a militia could be, a third-party watchdog of both the government and extremist groups.
I'm trying to change how you look at the militia.
Their methods, though, are controversial, and many say problematic.
Now, this movement's really controversial, right? The vast majority of Americans don't believe that the modern militia movement is appropriate or needed or necessary, especially since we have like modern police forces and modern, advanced military, National Guard, etc. However, groups like the Proud Boys, for example, are probably one of the more notorious examples of these kind of like right-wing, typically all-male militia groups. However, as we saw from the video earlier, not all militia groups are white, right? Not all militia groups are right-wing either. So it's very, very, very complicated. And probably the best example of the controversial nature of some of these militia groups is what happened on January 6, 2021, which we've mentioned once or twice before. But, people thought Trump should have won the election and it was stolen from him, and thousands of Trump supporters descended on the Capitol. Some of those supporters ended up, breaking into the Capitol and, being arrested and whatnot. However, militias were a really core kind of component of the collection of individuals who gathered together to protest certification of the election. And to this day, especially right-wing conservative militia groups are some of the most diehard Trump supporters out there. However, if you look at history, I think the founders mostly would not have been supportive of this. And I think a good example of that is the Whiskey Rebellion. So what was the Whiskey Rebellion and what did it have to do with militias? So in 1794, a coalition of Pennsylvania farmers, angry about a federal tax on whiskey, which was cutting into their profits, armed themselves and intimidated federal tax collectors. They believed, and it was the people who participated in this, they believed they were legitimately defending their liberties. So again, this was just like 6 or so years after the ratification of the Constitution, and people were still working out what these various sections meant. And a lot of people thought, well, the Second Amendment basically reserves a right to resist, to protest, to fight against the federal government if we deem that they're tyrannical. However, the government largely disagreed. Most government officials, even anti-federalists, disagreed with this and supported using the militia to stop the uprising. This is just one of several uprisings that happened in early America, as different groups, thought, well, we're just continuing the spirit of the revolution, right? However, this view was largely disfavored, and one could even say disproven, as pretty much every rebellion that happened in early America was crushed by the militia, and even people who favored states' rights versus the federal government thought that this was appropriate. So this whole idea of, does the Second Amendment outline a right to resist? Well, a handful of people thought it did, but the vast majority of people, and I think the historical record says, that was not a core part of the original meaning of the Second Amendment. I'm going to take a little break here, and I would like you to respond to some of the things we've talked about. And here's what you're being tasked with. Imagine that you have just been given access to a time machine and tasked with going back to the founding era and advising the founders as they crafted the Second Amendment. And then you have 3 options. Choose the prompt that's kind of the most relevant in terms of what you want to focus on. What advice would you give them and why? So in other words, some things have happened since they wrote the Second Amendment, and maybe there's some things you would want to tell them about. Prompt 2, what would you make the Second Amendment say if you could help rewrite it? And prompt 3, if you think the amendment is just fine as it is, why do you think this? So again, maybe you're like, I don't want to change it. I don't want to advise them. You can say that. So just pick one of these 3, respond. I'm interested to see what you have to say. So you might be asking yourself this question: where did the individual rights theory of the Second Amendment come from? And basically for the rest of the class today I'm going to be answering that question. In order to answer the question of where did the individual rights theory or interpretation of the Second Amendment come from, we need to deal with everybody's favorite topic, race. Because it was essentially slavery and the Civil War in the era after the Civil War that really gave us this argument. So let's look at that. So in the 1820s, as individualism became the American norm, which we've talked about, before, some states started amending their constitutions to explicitly protect private gun ownership rights. So, quick refresher there: the Bill of Rights did not apply to the states; only applied to the federal government. And there were some states who said, well, we if the Second Amendment does not explicitly protect individual gun rights, we want our own state laws and constitutional amendments to protect gun ownership rights in our states. And that's exactly what they did. Additionally, at the same time, some lawyers and judges started interpreting the Second Amendment in more individualistic terms. However, these were kind of like, kind of these movements bubbling up, this kind of shifting understanding of the Second Amendment. However, the thing that really changed it was slavery. So how and why and how did this all pan out? Let's look at it. Before the Civil War, some radical abolitionists argued that the Second Amendment permitted enslaved people to use violence to achieve freedom. Now, no historian would say that's what the founders meant. However, as we've seen over and over again in this class, it kind of doesn't matter what the founders meant if American society starts to shift and decide this is what I think X, Y, and Z means, and then that's what it means. And for some radical abolitionists, the very, very, very small sliver of them believed that the Second Amendment essentially created a right for enslaved people to arm themselves and fight against their masters. However, unsurprisingly, most white folks rejected this view, right? I mean, obviously, like slaveholding states are going to say, no, that's ridiculous. Even a lot of like northern people who were against slavery thought that this was too extreme and too radical. However, it effectively placed the individual rights theory at the center of constitutional discourse, right? So again, various groups and individuals in various parts of America are beginning to read the Second Amendment this way, in particular, the argument of radical abolitionists, I think because it was so controversial, I think kind of invited a lot of people to respond. And, this really marks the beginning of this discourse kind of entering into American society. Here's a quote from a radical abolitionist, John Brown. I, John Brown, am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away, but with blood. So again, by radical abolitionists, we mean, people who were willing to use kind of instances of violence. Obviously, if you know the story of John Brown, he was one of those people, and you can Google him if you want to learn more about him. But he was one of the people who was advocating for violent uprising of enslaved folks and their allies against people who were trying to enslave others. And part of their argument was, well, this is what the Second Amendment tells us we can do, right? Again, for reasons I don't have to explain to you, most folks were not like, oh, this is great, right? And if you know much about this history, you know that rebellion amongst enslaved people was a kind of constant problem and fear. And to tie us back into the beginning of the conversation, this is part of the reason why we have this militia tradition, right? Was because, how are you going to stop a slave rebellion? Well, a militia is probably the best way to do that. Ironically, Southern white men most resisted the individual rights theory of the Second Amendment, right? Well, why? Well, again, because most of the people who were saying it were radical abolitionists who wanted, enslaved folks to kill their masters. So clearly, most Southern white men are not going to be like, oh, that's a great idea. After Reconstruction, white Southerners restricted the rights of Black folks through laws that included the disarming or taking guns away from Black citizens and barring non-whites from militia service. So why am I saying all this? Well, it's fascinating today that, today when you think of people who are super against gun legislation, generally speaking, it's, conservative white people, not exclusively, but I think conservative white people tend to dominate that camp, right? Whereas at this time, it was conservative white people who were actually promoting gun control, but not gun control for everybody, right? Gun control for a particular group of people. And this is just like one of the ways that history is really fascinating and confounding, right? Is that like sometimes entire demographics of American society completely flip their views based on changing circumstances in society. So a quick refresher, after the Civil War, for roughly 14 years, there's this era known as Reconstruction. Reconstruction is basically when the northern governments, particularly the northern military, is occupying certain sections of the South to guarantee that Black men at the time, because again, women couldn't vote, Black men could vote, that Black people in general were not being terrorized by the KKK and were having their rights protected. During this era, about 1/3 of Union soldiers occupying the South during Reconstruction were Black, right? And this absolutely horrified Southern whites, right? So, I mean, they had just been defeated in a war that basically, forced to rejoin a country they didn't want to, and then occupied by, the very demographic of people that they had viewed as human property before. And this was just absolutely galling and humiliating and infuriating for millions of Southern white folks. So in the years after, there were a series of laws passed. So Black Codes is kind of the early iteration. The kind of later iteration is Jim Crow laws. They're pretty much the same thing, just kind of different era. But long story short, we're all familiar with Jim Crow laws, like the laws mandating racial segregation, separate public accommodations, keeping Black people from voting, etc. So part of these Black Codes of Jim Crow laws was disarming, was preventing Black people from owning guns, either taking those guns away, preventing them from participating in the militia, and preventing them from legally purchasing and owning guns in most Southern states. Here's a little video clip about that.
Gun control in the US has racist past and present. In fact, most gun control laws throughout history were aimed at preventing Black people getting their hands on guns. Here's how. As early as the 1600s, colonies in the States were passing laws that prohibited African Americans from possessing arms. But then the Second Amendment came along in 1791. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Many Americans interpreted this to mean that they, as individuals, had the right to carry guns. Meaning every individual, right? Wrong. Having been emancipated after the Civil War, Southern states passed laws known as Black Codes in 1865 and 1866. Among other things, those laws disarmed former slaves in order to sustain white control. In fact, African Americans were already at a disadvantage. They lost their right to vote in many states because of poll taxes and literacy tests. Exploiting many people's inabilities to read and write, states could further impose gun restrictions.
Furthermore, post-Reconstruction, so after Reconstruction ends, Southern whites used extrajudicial violence, which is punishment for an alleged crime applied outside of the legal or judicial system, to enforce white supremacy at all levels. Right? The KKK is probably the best and most notorious example of this. And then, hopefully in your mind, you're bringing in other things we looked at. We talked about miscegenation laws. Miscegenation laws were often used as kind of pretexts and excuses to kill particularly Black men, whether they had actually violated them or not, right? So it was a very, very, very bad time to be a Black person in the South. And sadly, extrajudicial racist violence is a deeply American tradition, right? In other words, this is not the only example of it. Both before and during the Jim Crow era, similar tactics were used to tame and settle the Western frontier, right? We've seen a little bit of that when we talked about westward expansion and Manifest Destiny and the Indian Wars. However, we're going to kind of revisit that because I think putting it in this context of this culture of gun ownership, why do Americans love guns so much? I think the West is a huge part of it. So before we got to the West, I did want to deal with this because I think this is a really fascinating case study, right? That sometimes the people in the past who supported gun control are demographically today the people who are most resistant to it. Well, why? Well, race is one of those reasons, unfortunately. So long story short, this whole Second Amendment issue is just really, really deeply complicated. And just to relate this to some things we talked about at the beginning of class, this is why folks like, this guy, Nick Bezel, who's the head of this, all Black kind of militant pro-gun militia, is very aware of this history, is very aware that, gun laws have been used at various times to prevent Black people from owning guns. And part of the reason why, kind of left-wing Black militias exist in the first place is a kind of reaction to an awareness of this history, and again, bringing the history up to kind of current realities. All right, so I hope I've done a pretty good job of just explaining the Second Amendment, what it originally mean, and what are some of the ways that its meaning and understanding were kind of morphing, and also how did race play in some early gun control measures in the South in particular. And I think the last piece of really important context before we further explore gun ownership issues today is the Western frontier. I'm calling this section the Western Frontier Myth and Reality. Now, I've mentioned this before, but I think it's important to reiterate here. When I say myth or mythology, I'm not saying, like it's a lie. I'm using myth in the more kind of anthropological sense. So in this context, myths are narratives that societies tell themselves to reinforce their beliefs. In this context, myths are not a question of is it true or is it false? The question is, what do the stories that culture tells reveal about collective beliefs, right? So again, you say that about ancient Greek myths, right? Which kind of see pictured here. Ancient Greek myths, they weren't, obviously they're myths in the sense that they weren't true. But whether they're true or not, it doesn't matter. In the anthropological understanding of myth, a myth is like a story that culture tells themselves, right? And I think the West and the Western frontier and Western expansion and all that stuff really gave America some very indelible and deep and important myths that I think really help us understand America's relationship to guns. So it is to that I want to turn to. So again, the Western frontier is real. It's a real thing that actually happened. But the real experience of the Western frontier created a kind of shared set of stories and narratives, and even a very influential literary genre, which has a lot to say about Americans' relationship to guns. Now, again, we've already talked about this, and we talked about westward expansion, Manifest Destiny, and the Indian Wars. So I want to kind of pivot from the actual history itself and talk more about the kind of mythology and ideology and just ideas and beliefs that Americans developed during this era of westward expansion. And I think this article did a really good job of detailing that, right? Just quick refresher, this was your second talkback article for this section. And essentially, it kind of made the argument that, the frontier, although yes, there was this actual kind of objective geographic region outside of the borders of the United States, that the frontier was much more a mentality and a mindset and kind of a collective belief than it was an actual place, right? Because the actual place, people already lived there, right? It was already settled, right? Spanish-speaking Mexicans had been there for generations and generations. Native Americans have been there for probably thousands of years. So it was not like empty land that didn't belong to anybody. But in the minds of the people moving west, it was theirs to be conquered. And again, we've talked about this already, so you're like, we already know this. But what I think I want to do now is pivot and talk about I think actually like a literary genre that came out of this, which is not a literary genre that's very popular today, but for a long time was the most important American literary genre, and that is the Western. And the Western, again, is going to tie this history into the culture of gun ownership. So what is the Western genre? It comes directly out of the frontier, right? The allure of the frontier and the history of violent masculinity that it glorified birthed a key American literary genre, the Western. So Westerns are not super popular today. A lot of people, in your generation have never even seen a Western. Like, there's, today there's like video games, there's every once in a while there's movies, every once in a while there's a TV show. I say every once in a while because it's just not as popular as it used to be. I think American society's kind of moved on. I think superheroes are kind of the new Western genre, but that's neither here nor there. But assuming that some of you don't know what the Western is, you can kind of tell from this picture, right? The Western genre was about, cowboys and the frontier and the Wild Wild West and gunfights and kind of taming this land. And people have noted that Western kind of has a white supremacist bent. Not kind of, it does. I mean, obviously there's some black cowboys eventually depicted in the Western, but that was much later. So again, assuming you don't know a lot about the Western, let's kind of jump into it and say, where did it start and where did it go? Well, it starts in the form of paperback novels, and then in films, stories of brave cowboys and wild outlaws, quote, taming the West, unquote, and its inhabitants through violence became key to the Western genre. So again, the basic core of the Western is typically powerful white men are, going out into the Wild West. Maybe it's like a town ruled by outlaws, maybe it's Native American territory, right? Whatever. And they're kind of taming it for white civilization. And again, cowboys and horses and all that good stuff is kind of part of it. For about 50 years, Western movies in particular were the most popular films in America, with nearly 1,000 titles being made per year at their peak. Superhero movies are huge today, but we get maybe like 30 superhero movies. Again, at their peak, there were over 1,000 Western films being made each year. So let's break this down a little bit and kind of look at the progression of the Western. So again, the Western starts out as novels. Here's an example of an early Western. As you can see, this person is wearing kind of like very traditional kind of early 1800s pioneer clothing, right? The pioneers, again, this is a very broad category of people who were moving further and further west to explore and to settle, in some cases in American territory, in some cases outside of American territory. But the exploits of these people were first immortalized and celebrated in, kind of cheap mass-printed novels that were becoming more and more popular, particularly in the late 1800s in the United States. And there were also, this is a magazine, right? A magazine contains stories, sketches, etc. of Western life. And here we see depicted a kind of classic kind of trope. A trope is like a story that gets told over and over again of the Western, which directly ties to this whole miscegenation law thing we've looked at, and kind of this history of fears of interracial sex, one of the most popular Western stories was where, you know, a Native American, kind of a scary Native American man would capture a white woman and force her to be his bride. And then, you know, the white man would go and save her and rescue her from savagery, right? Now, this did actually happen every once in a while. There were kidnappings of white people by Native Americans. However, the stories of this far outweigh the actual historical incidents of it, and whether they happen or not, I think is less important. What is important is how these stories contribute to this mythology, right? Specifically, this mythology of strong white men using violence to tame kind of the savagery of the West. And again, Native Americans were both a direct kind of target of that violence, and also they were, in these stories, they were used as kind of like a metaphor for the wildness of the West and the need, quote unquote, to tame it. And then kind of moving ahead, you know, we're getting more into kind of the 1950s and the Cold War era. The Westerns were hugely popular basically up until the 1960s. And, you know, starts in novels, magazines, you know, comic books. It was a genre that appeared in a variety of media and formats. And I think probably the best example of that is Western movies, which were probably the most important kind of proliferator, I guess, of Western narratives. So, for example, there is a movie called from 1903. It's one of the first kind of long form early silent movies. By long form, I think it was like 8 minutes long, which was really long for the time. You know, early silent movies like a minute. And this movie is considered one of possibly the first Western ever. I mean, it's a pretty simple story. Basically, there's like a train robbery, some bandits come, and then the good guys with guns stop the train robbers, and, you know, the day is saved. But in the early silent era in the United States, Westerns were some of the most popular forms of film. And getting on into the sound era and the early black and white movies. So this is from the 1930s, I believe this movie was from. As movies get bigger and more expensive and more elaborate, you know, the films themselves get more epic and huge. You know, these movies were so big that they were, you know, exported all over the world.
Streamlined world today, adventure takes wings. Planes scuttle across country at a blazing speed. Man has raced around the earth in less than 4 days. Planes roar at 400 miles an hour. Airships, streamlined trains and buses speed thousands to new frontiers. Yet well within the span of our memory, the streamliner of its day, the American stagecoach, crossed the uncharted rugged West, bringing new people to a new country. What fascinating stories there were in the life of the stagecoach, and in the lives of its courageous passengers who found romance in danger and understanding in strange companionships. From the adventures of these American frontier characters, John Ford has created a truly great motion picture, Stagecoach, a drama as forceful and as true as The Informer, and as gripping as The Hurricane.
You all hear what the lieutenant said?
What are you trying to do, scare somebody?
If you'll take my advice, ma'am, you won't take this trip.
My husband is with his troops in Dry Fork. If he's in danger, I want to be with him.
All right, folks.
Hey, Curly, why don't you take the cuffs off the kid? He's mighty handy with a gun.
You drive them horses. I'll take care of the kid.
The man works all his life to get a hold of some money so that he can enjoy life, and has to run into a trap like this.
Trap, brother? You mean the Apaches? There's been no sign of them.
You don't see any signs of them. They strike like rattlesnakes.
You talk too much, Gatewood.
Don't, Fritz, don't please.
Take it easy, Gatewood. We may need that fighting before we get to the ferry.
You wouldn't be much good in a fight, you jailbird.
Oh, leave the kid alone. He's handcuffed.
Ringo asked me to marry him. Is that wrong for a girl like me? If a man and woman love each other, it's all right, ain't it, Doc?
Don't you know that boy's headed back for prison? Besides, if you two go into Lordsburg together, he's got to know all about you.
You didn't answer what I asked you last night.
Look, kid, why don't you try to escape?
I gotta go to Lordsburg. Why don't you go to my ranch and wait for me?
Wait for a dead man.
So this graph is just showing you kind of the raw numbers of the number of Westerns being made each year. And as you can see, at its peak in the early 1940s, there were almost 1,000 Westerns coming out in that peak year. Now, most of these Westerns were cheap. I mean, one of the reasons why there were so many of them too is they were easy to make. You know, if you were a small independent studio, all you needed was like some horses and some desert and some white people dressed up like Native Americans, which is, you know, what they all did back then. You know, by the time you get to the 1980s, which is kind of when the Western really starts to like largely wane in popularity and influence, there had been thousands of Westerns produced over this, you know, roughly century of film. A taste of kind of the flavor and the attitudes and some of the tropes. So remember, trope is like a story you see over and over again. I'm going to play you a scene from a movie called Fistful of Dollars. So Fistful of Dollars stars Clint Eastwood. Some of you might know him. He's one of the more kind of popular tough guy actors in the in the 60s and 70s. You know, he was kind of like the who's the guy who plays John Wick? That guy. Keanu Reeves, right? This kind of like tough guy who kills lots of people in multiple movies. Again, this is from a movie by an Italian director, which is an Italian director made for the American market and did really well in America. But either way, I think it really captures kind of the vibe and the aesthetic and the attitude of the Western.
Get 3 coffins ready.
Huh?
Adios, amigo. Listen, stranger. Did you get the idea? We don't like to see bad boys like you in town. Go get your mule. You let him get away from you?
You see, that's what I want to talk to you about. He's feeling real bad.
Huh?
My mule. You see, he got all riled up when you men fired those shots at his feet.
Hey, you making some kind of joke?
No. You see, I understand you men were just playing around, but the mule, he just doesn't get it. Of course, if you were to all apologize... I don't think it's nice, you laughing. You see, my mule don't like people laughing. It's the crazy idea you're laughing at him. Now, if you apologize like I know you're going to, I might convince him that you really didn't mean it.
I saw the whole thing. You killed all 4 of them. You'll pay all right. You'll be strung up.
Who are you?
Don't fire a shot. I'm John Baxter, sheriff.
Yeah, well, if you're the sheriff, you better get these men on the ground.
The third phase in the popularity of the Western was television. So American television really becomes an important and influential part of American culture in the 1950s, and basically, I think, was the most important and influential media in America pretty much until the internet comes along. And very early on, in the early days of television, people figured out that Westerns were hugely popular. So, for example, Gunsmoke and Bonanza, they were both shows that aired in the early 60s through, I guess, starting in the early 60s and through the end of the 60s, actually. These are, if you look at, lists of the top 10 or 20 most successful and most watched TV shows from kind of the early television era, these two shows are almost always on there. And nowadays you can stream them, you can buy them on DVD. So again, even though they're not as popular as they used to be, they're still very much around. Probably one of the most controversial legacies of the Western is the way that Native Americans were portrayed. In the kind of imagination of white settlers moving west, they generally viewed Native Americans, as we've already seen, as just kind of these like speed bumps on their road to greatness. And unfortunately, Hollywood movies very much depicted them that way. The Native Americans in Westerns, basically until the 90s is really when this started to change. In the era when like Westerns weren't that popular anyway. Native Americans in Hollywood Westerns are A, they're generally played by white people, as you can probably tell here. B, they were viewed as this kind of like backward savages, kind of like monstrous people with pre-Christian traditions that mark them as kind of like other and scary and monstrous, and they were portrayed as kind of like expendable. And what I want to do here is kind of pause a little bit and play a video. This is a really interesting video from a professor of American Studies whose father was actually like a really influential actor in Hollywood Westerns. And I think he has a really unique perspective on this, and we'll kind of share the perspective, but also just, I think, kind of deepen our understanding of how these movies worked and how they impacted people then and now.
My father was a Hollywood stuntman. After he got out of the war, he kicked around Hollywood wanting to be an actor, and he fell into stunt work, mostly doing underwater stunts. He was like the third person to put on the creature of the Black Lagoon costume, so he was the creature at one point. But he fell into Westerns. So he did a lot of great Westerns, a lot of John Ford Westerns, John Wayne Westerns, worked with Howard Hawks, and he was instrumental in building up Old Tucson.
For over 50 years, Old Tucson Studio has been an important part of the magic of movie making. And at one time or another, almost every major star has walked these historic streets. Over 20 live shows are performed at Old Tucson daily, including the most authentic gunfight reenactments anywhere.
So I was born into this context, and I was raised out at Old Tucson. I was a child actor. I did jobs out at Old Tucson. So, the Western is something that's just intrinsically part of my character and life. But as I start to study it when I come to school and I start to confront ideas of white privilege and the media representing only a specific point of view, and that being a very white point of view, and I can see how the Western has achieved this sort of huge building block in this attitude. The West was being mythologized even as it was being enacted. So the historical West and the mythological West are two very different things. And it's this legend that speaks to a lot of intrinsic values of the country, of freedom, of individuality. Certainly an ideal notion of masculinity is perpetuated by the Western. But mostly, above all, it's a very Anglo-centered view of manifest destiny. There is an effacement of people of color. This effacement of an entire segment of non-white culture leads people to believe that there were no black cowboys, when in fact 1 out of every 4 cowboy in the West was black. White pioneers coming to the West already were coming to a culture, a cowboy culture established by Mexican vaqueros. That the West is this really complicated collision and imbrication of cultures. But we don't see that. The most egregious thing you could really level against the Western is the way it treats indigenous peoples. They are an obstacle. They are embodiments of the savagery of the West that needs to be tamed to make sure that American civilization comes through. You don't see their point of view. They emerge out of the wilderness as hostile. There's no real talk about why they're hostile. They're just a problem that needs to be solved, and usually through violence. There's this idea of justified violence to enable the coming of America. While a lot of Westerns kind of towed the line as far as reinforcing dominant ideology, there have always been Westerns that have questioned that ideology. Whether that was through gender, like one of my favorites is Johnny Guitar with Joan Crawford. Films questioning the white-centric focus of the genre. Posse, a 1993 movie directed by Mario Van Peebles, using the Western to say something. I'm an instructor with the School of Film, Theater, and Television. I specialize in film history. The whole class is designed to introduce students, these are film and television students, to the Western genre because many of them perhaps haven't been exposed to it. They don't really know its importance, and it's really designed to let them know just how influential the genre is as far as establishing not only a form of American mythology, but how it influences contemporary cinema today. As much as I love the genre, it is problematic. It does have a number of things that speak to the problems we're experiencing today.
The Western genre is pretty like not consequential in American culture right now, right? There are just not that many Western movies being produced. Every once in a while, some studio will make one and like almost nobody goes to see it. However, the kind of narrative framing of the Western, and again, some of the ways the stories are structured are still very much with us. And here's some examples. So Red Dead Redemption is a game series that's been around for a while. It's a really critically acclaimed game series, and it directly draws from the Western and is kind of, again, porting it and resurrecting it to, a more contemporary medium, which is, the video game industry. A lot of people will point to, like Star Wars. When the original Star Wars came out in 1977, I believe is when it came out, a lot of critics made fun of it because they said, well, it's just like a Western in space. And I think Boba Fett is a really good example of that. So, if kind of the current Star Wars stuff, there's like The Mandalorian, and Boba Fett, both of which are like deeply, deeply indebted to the Western. I think Boba Fett in particular, right? This whole thing of like a man coming to a lawless town and kind of killing the bad guys using violence, right? So, again, the Western is still with us, even though the actual genre itself is not that powerful. Another example too, Yellowstone. So I don't know if Yellowstone's on your radar. Yellowstone is one of the most popular and critically acclaimed, actually, streaming shows on TV. Is on the Paramount Network. Is particularly popular with conservative Americans who have really embraced it and feel like it is a very kind of like laudatory updating of some of the tropes of the Western to kind of contemporary American issues. The Western is like mostly dead as a genre, but not really. We're still very much feeling its influence today. And I want to kind of put this together with a final point. The Western genre captures the historical importance of guns and extrajudicial violence in the history of westward expansion. Right now, again, are Western movies actually historically accurate? Depends on which movie. However, they are kind of like ideologically accurate, I guess you could say, in terms of reflecting and popularizing and promoting this idea that throughout the history of the United States, white men in particular have used violence to achieve their ends, and that is okay. Western texts teach us that violence is good if the quote good guys unquote are doing it. This is the basic assumption of so much American entertainment, law, and culture. So again, the rhetoric of the Western is really, really, really powerful, even though Westerns themselves are not very influential and powerful, right? And, look at superhero movies. Again, look at Star Wars. Is so replete with tough people with weapons defeating some kind of evil or force or threat. And, the violence is never questioned. Well, why? Well, it is deeply ingrained in the American psyche that violence is okay if the good guys are doing it. And again, I'm not trying to make a point. I'm not saying that's wrong. I'm not saying it's right or wrong. I'm just saying that it is a kind of set of American assumptions that most of us never question, right? And this idea that it's okay for good guys to use violence, is a basic assumption of so much entertainment and law, right? Which again, this brings us to our stand your ground laws. It brings us to, the Castle Doctrine. Why in America do we think it's okay to take someone else's life if you feel threatened? Well, a lot of reasons. I'm not saying the Western directly dictates this to us, but I think the Western is one really super important kind of aspect of American history and culture that really reinforces and propagates this narrative that, again, most Americans today don't question. Okay, so hopefully I've done a pretty good job just exploring the Second Amendment, what it actually meant, how some of those meanings changed, and also some things that seem completely unrelated to the Second Amendment, which was, Western movies, and how the Western literary genre, which seems completely disconnected from the Second Amendment, but I think definitely is not, is a good example of how specific ideas about violence and masculinity and self-defense and things like that have been circulating in American society for a century or more. And now I want to put all this together to talk about things that have happened within the past, kind of since the 1960s, because like so many things in this class, it comes back to the 1960s. So let's get into it. And let's talk about why now the Second Amendment does mean you have an individual right to own a gun. Well, why? Well, because of a Supreme Court decision, because that's kind of what Supreme Court decisions do, right? They interpret the law for us, regardless of their original meanings. So let's kind of zero in on that story and bring the then up to the now. But it's kind of asked this question. I think this political cartoon is kind of asking this question. If the original meaning of the Second Amendment was not to protect the individual right to own a weapon, how did that idea develop? So we've seen a little bit of that, but again, it hadn't really caught on, and it really was not until I think the 20th century that this really caught on. So let's talk about what happened. So think back to when we talked about the 1960s, right? The 1960s was a terrible time to be a conservative, and the 1960s really galvanized a lot of conservative people to kind of fight back and mobilize. And the Christian right is one example of that. Resistance to abortion in the late 70s, which emerged in kind of religious communities, is a good example of that. Another good example of that, which we haven't talked about, is the conservative legal movement. So what was that? Well, after the liberal victories of the 1960s, conservative legal scholars and think tanks, I'll explain what that is in a second, regrouped and mobilized to shift the courts in a rightward direction. So again, a think tank is like a nonprofit organization that produces like research and books and position papers trying to like sway Americans to believe certain positions or to accept certain policies. There are progressive think tanks, there are middle of the road think tanks, there are conservative think tanks. However, conservative think tanks tend to be more well-funded because people with a lot of money tend to be conservative, right? And conservative think tanks became like a huge kind of powerful mechanism of kind of conservative activism, starting really in the 1970s and 80s, kind of continuing through today. For example, the current Supreme Court majority is a direct product of this movement. So here we're looking at Neil Gorsuch, Amy Coney Barrett, Brett Kavanaugh, the three most recent additions to the Supreme Court, all of which were nominated and approved under Donald Trump's administration, and all of whom are very conservative, and all of whom kind of cut their teeth, when they were younger, were kind of shaped by this conservative legal movement. The individual rights theory of the Second Amendment became a major platform for this movement. So again, this idea was not created by these conservative think tanks, but more and more conservative think tanks, particularly because of some things I'm going to talk about shortly, started to view gun rights as under threat from kind of creeping federal legislation to make certain guns illegal and make it harder to get certain guns in some cases, and simultaneously started kind of propagating this idea that the First Amendment was about the individual right to own a gun. In addition to the conservative legal movement, we absolutely need to talk about the National Rifle Association, or the NRA, who played a really, really, really crucial role in kind of popularizing and promoting this idea that the Second Amendment originally meant and has always meant a right for individuals to bear arms for private use. And I'm going to pause here again and just play a little video that I think will explain to you where the NRA came from and how they changed in the 1960s, and how to this day, even though they're not as powerful as they were, their rhetoric and the ideas that they've introduced into American society are still extraordinarily powerful. Check this out.
Everyone knows the National Rifle Association is super powerful, but how to get that way? Here's a brief history. The NRA was founded in 1871 by Civil War veterans concerned that their fellow Yankees had forgotten how to shoot. They started the NRA to fix that. The whole idea was to promote rifle practice. Over the next few decades, the NRA waded gently into politics. In the 1930s, for instance, when gangsters with Tommy guns were all over the news, Congress debated a bill called the Firearms Act, which is widely known as the first real gun control bill. The NRA opposed it, lobbying Congress to take out any mention of pistols and revolvers, but they were willing to live with regulations on submachine guns and sawed-off shotguns. So, by today's standards, pretty tame. Let's fast forward to the 1960s. We had the civil rights movement, urban riots, students protesting the Vietnam War, rising crime rates, and a number of high-profile assassinations, from JFK to MLK Jr. To many in mainstream America, there was just this feeling that violence was overtaking society. So in 1968, when the Black Panthers began to carry guns as an act of civil disobedience, it was a bridge too far for middle-class, especially white Americans. Lawmakers across the country, liberals and conservatives alike, began pushing for gun control laws. The Republican Party's national platform even supported gun control on tough-on-crime grounds. And in California, Governor Ronald Reagan led the gun control charge. But the reaction was swift. Gun owners, especially rural conservatives, already alienated by rapid cultural shifts, began to worry. Was the government coming for their guns next? So they began mobilizing, lobbying, and joining the NRA. Between 1964 and 1980, NRA membership tripled, from 600,000 to nearly 2 million, and its coffers exploded with new dues. For the NRA's old guard, who still thought of the NRA as a shooting club, it was a weird time. In 1977, new NRA members ousted the old board and replaced them with new and much more political leadership. From there on out, the NRA was extremely hardline about opposing all gun control.
I am against the kind of gun control that is being talked in the Congress of the United States. I see it as only something that would make it difficult for an honest citizen to own a gun, but would do nothing at all to impede the criminal in his getting a gun.
And in 1980, it endorsed its first presidential candidate, Ronald Reagan. In the 1990s, 2 gun control laws were passed, but they were relatively limited in scope and built to expire.
Since the Brady Bill passed, 250,000 felons, fugitives, and mentally unstable persons have been stopped from purchasing handguns.
And then, in the early 2000s, the NRA really began to hit its stride.
From my cold, dead hands.
It rolled out its grading system, issuing A+s to politicians most in line with its vision, and Fs to those in favor of gun control. Voters take that system seriously. The right grade makes or breaks a politician's career. A few years later, in 2008, it won a huge Supreme Court case, finding that the Second Amendment guaranteed private individuals, and not just a well-regulated militia, a constitutional right to own guns. In 2016, the NRA spent $419 million on political campaigns, and more than $30 million on Donald Trump alone.
There's no bigger fan of the Second Amendment than me, and there's no bigger fan of the NRA.
It also endorsed Trump earlier than it had endorsed any presidential contender ever.
I'm officially announcing the NRA's endorsement of Donald Trump for president.
Today, the NRA is, by nearly any measure, at the top of its political power. But it's also facing a brand new challenge: furious teenagers.
To every politician who is taking donations from the NRA, shame on you.
In the name of 17 people, you cannot ask the NRA to keep their money out of your campaign.
After the mass shooting in Parkland, Florida, young people have been staging walkouts, planning protests, and demanding exactly the kind of gun control the NRA has spent the last 50 years fighting.
So if that's how the NRA started out, what changed? Well, the 60s. During the 60s and 70s, a series of public assassinations, so John F. Kennedy is JFK, Martin Luther King, MLK, were probably the 2 most famous public assassinations, and rising violent crime rates. So a quick refresher, remember after Martin Luther King in particular was assassinated, right, there were roughly 120, or between 120 and 130 violent, destructive uprisings all across the country in kind of reaction to that. And in the years after, especially as white flight and deindustrialization are gutting America's cities just become more violent. And violent crime rates are going up and up and up. And more people are calling for gun control. And the NRA, this is really when they start to get political. So the NRA dramatically shifted during this period, focusing almost exclusively on political lobbying for gun rights and mobilizing against any and all gun controls. So again, the NRA started out just as kind of like a gun safety, gun training organization. the 1960s as part of this kind of conservative backlash against the liberalism and radicalism of the 1960s. The NRA really embraces this kind of hardline position, right? And when I say mobilizing against any and all gun controls, as we're going to talk about, one of the reasons why, and again, regardless of what side of the issue you're on, I think this is important to understand. One of the reasons why it's so hard to get federal gun legislation passed is because there is a decades-long campaign, really started by the NRA, but kind of continued by just millions of everyday Americans who think gun ownership is really important, to view all gun controls as a direct attack and threat against their basic rights, right? Last point, they and their allies embraced the individual rights theory of the Second Amendment and effectively popularized it as the meaning of the amendment. So again, quick summary of history, it was definitely not the original meaning of the amendment. There were some people in the kind of early days before the Civil War and after the Civil War who believed that, but it was not the dominant view. And the Second Amendment kind of like disappears from American life. During the Westward expansion era, obviously guns are really important, but like guns are just a part of American culture. And that was not because of the Second Amendment. However, 1960s happen as more and more states and the federal government are trying to limit and restrict gun access. This really is the beginning of this kind of polarized response towards gun ownership, right? Either you love the Second Amendment and you oppose all gun laws, or you hate the Second Amendment and you want to take away people's freedoms, right? One more important point before we kind of move away from the NRA and talk about the Supreme Court decision is that so the video I played for you was made a few years ago, and the NRA is actually not doing well for reasons that have almost nothing to do with guns. Basically, starting like 2017, I think is when this started. The NRA was rocked by a series of scandals in which, so let me back up. So the NRA, it's a nonprofit organization, right? And if you give money to the NRA, is considered a charitable donation. And, charitable organizations are not allowed to spend lavishly on themselves and pay their, pay their leaders millions of dollars to go and have fancy vacations, right? However, it came out that was what the NRA was doing. The NRA was just wasting millions and millions and millions of dollars, and also breaking some laws in various states and whatnot. And I think declared bankruptcy. I can't remember when it was in the past few years. And the NRA as an organization really is kind of in free fall. Like they're just not the powerful player that they were 6 years ago. However, it almost doesn't matter in a way. At least it doesn't matter in terms of understanding this narrative, because the rhetorics, the ideas, the arguments that the NRA has been crafting and kind of circulating in pro-gun cultures for decades are very, 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 very powerful. And for a lot of people persuasive, and have really, if the NRA disappears completely, these arguments will be with us probably for decades. For example, it is a very powerful and persuasive narrative, particularly in conservative spaces, that any and all gun control is actually part of this kind of conspiracy to disarm America, so that, in particular, kind of liberal progressives can oppress, the red-blooded patriotic Americans who are keeping tyranny at bay with their weapons. So this is kind of a fringe theory that most Americans don't hold. However, it is a very, very powerful theory and idea. So, for example, this is an ad from a kind of anti-progressive website called MeetBloomberg.com. It's not important. I'm not going to go into the details. The important thing is this: just the rhetoric that we see here. Keep your hands off our guns. Protect freedom. Right. So again, there is this very, very powerful rhetoric on the right that, so for example, there's been a federal law that's been debated to shorten the size of magazine clips for AR-15s and other large weapons that some people call assault weapons. That has repeatedly gone nowhere, largely because of rhetoric like this, right? Because particularly people who vote Republican tend to see even what some might call common sense. Some on the left would say these are common sense gun reforms, right? Small changes in the law that will significantly reduce an individual's ability to kill large numbers of people. However, people on the right view these as kind of like an existential threat.
Dear Joe Biden, we aren't terrorists. We aren't the enemy.
We're the good guys.
The idea we still allow semi-automatic weapons to be purchased is sick. It's just sick.
Sick? Really? Tell that to the pregnant mother who saved her kids with an AR-15.
The fact is that the AR-15 is America's most popular rifle, used for self-defense, hunting, and shooting sports.
Americans own more than 30 million of these modern-day muskets.
Ban assault weapons now. Ban them now. In 10 years, that ban was law, mass shootings went down after we let it expire in the Republican administration.
When you were U.S. Senator, you voted and America banned these from 1994 to 2004.
And murder rates were 19.3% higher.
It's failed policy. The vast majority of crimes were never even being committed with assault weapons in the first place.
They're not a criminal's weapon of choice.
The facts are on our side. Guns save lives, and you'll never stop us from defending our families.
Joe,
come and take it. Come and take it.
Come and take it.
Come and take it.
Come and take it.
So in this view, any and all gun legislation is a direct kind of existential threat to this basic right that a lot of people find really important. And here's just some more examples of it. One of the reasons why we don't have a lot of gun laws in America is because of this rhetoric, right? What if I told you gun control is about control and not guns? So again, on the right, a lot of people feel like it's not about actually reducing killings. It's not about making guns less accessible to people who are going to use them for bad things. It's about controlling people, and in particular, controlling conservative people, right? Here's just another example. My body, my choice include the means of protecting it. So some of you might be kind of seething right now. If you're very strongly for abortion rights, this might make you angry. Why? Well, my body, my choice is a phrase that is traditionally used by folks who strongly support abortion rights, right? And basically whoever made this meme is kind of taking that and flipping it and kind of like using progressive arguments against progressives for conservative causes, right? So in this view, it is a basic human right of just personal autonomy and freedom to be able to own large weapons that can kill large numbers of people. So the last thing we need to talk about that helps explain where we are today is the Supreme Court decision, District of Columbia versus Heller, which was issued in 2008. I'm going to pause here and let this video kind of give you an overview.
Hoping to reduce violent crime in the city, the Washington, D.C. City Council passed the Firearms Control Regulations Act of 1975, which effectively banned individual gun ownership in the district. The act generally prohibited D.C. residents from possessing handguns, but made some exceptions for police officers and security guards. The act also prohibited residents from keeping firearms in their homes without licenses, and required that any licensed firearm kept in the home either be unloaded and disassembled or fitted with a trigger lock. Dick Heller worked as a special police officer in Washington, D.C. As part of his employment, he was allowed to carry a handgun while at work. Wanting to keep a handgun in his home after hours, he applied for a license to do so. The District of Columbia denied Heller's application. Heller sued the District of Columbia for violating his Second Amendment rights. Based on its reading, the district court found that the Second Amendment doesn't create an individual right to gun ownership unrelated to service in an organized militia, such as the National Guard, and dismissed Heller's complaint. The Court of Appeals found that the Second Amendment does create an individual right to gun ownership and reversed the lower court's decision. The United States Supreme Court granted certiorari.
So as the video said, Dick Heller was a cop in Washington, D.C., and he wanted to have a gun off duty, and he was denied that ability to, and he sued. In 2003, Dick Heller challenged a Washington, D.C. gun control law, saying it violated his Second Amendment rights. Now, again, 2008 is when it got to the Supreme Court, because, again, the way court cases work, it takes sometimes years for a court case to wind its way through the court system to get to the Supreme Court. Eventually it did, and here is what happened. The case went to SCOTUS against the Supreme Court of the United States, and the court ruled in Heller's favor, arguing that the Second Amendment protected an individual's right to arm themselves. This was the first time the court had discovered this right. And again, I put discovered in quotation marks because there are some people who would say, well, that right was always there. But if you look at all of the Supreme Court decisions ever before this one, there's kind of no precedent for it. Now, again, you might say, well, that's fine. This is an important right. And who cares if the Supreme Court, kind of went against what they normally do. Again, I'm not saying this is good or bad. I think I'm just kind of like trying to set the historical record straight and say that this was kind of an unprecedented Supreme Court decision. Legal scholars right and left decried the decision as one without precedent. some of the strongest critics of this are actually conservative legal scholars, believe it or not. Why? Well, because if you know kind of constitutional philosophy, there are different ideas and beliefs about how this old document should apply to current American life. And generally speaking, conservatives tend to embrace something called constitutional originalism, which is the idea that we should interpret the Constitution as it was originally meant, which is what historians have been saying since forever. But when we apply it, we should apply it as close to the original meaning as possible. And a lot of people, not a lot of people, some legal scholars on the right said that this was not, that this was a completely novel interpretation and application that didn't exist before. And honestly, they were kind of right, at least from a Supreme Court standpoint. Regardless, it's now settled case law and has further emboldened the pro-gun lobby. So in other words, if you were to ask me, is the Second Amendment about an individual right to own guns, I would have to say yes now, because the Supreme Court has reinterpreted that, and when the Supreme Court reinterprets a law, that is the meaning of the law regardless of the original intent. So hopefully you've seen kind of the narrative arc of the Second Amendment, what it originally meant, what it means now, and why today, when we talk about the Second Amendment, we generally disagree over it in this context of gun rights versus gun control, which again was not a concern the founders had. However, for a lot of reasons we've looked at, is a huge concern that we have today. So to wrap up, I just want to look at one more thing, specifically this issue of gun control. I've been teaching college students for a long time, and I know that in the era of mass shootings and just more Americans owning guns than there are Americans, right? That a lot of people in your generation, this is a really anxiety-inducing issue, a bewildering, frustrating issue, and again, just a lot of college students I've dealt with over the years don't understand why we don't have more gun control legislation, right? And actually, if you look at the stats, support for gun laws has risen. And today, a majority of Americans support some form of gun control, of stricter gun measures. In particular, there are things called red flag laws, which basically say, if you want to buy a gun, you kind of have to go through like a screening process to see if there are kind of incidents of violence or like mental health in your background, and that might determine whether or not you get a gun. However, I did want to make just kind of one more point about gun control because, again, I don't think it's appropriate for me to say whether I'm for or against gun control. I do think it's appropriate, however, to kind of help you understand how complex these issues are. We Americans like things simple. You're for or against. Well, sometimes there's a lot of factors, whether you're for or against, that people who kind of land on these positions don't consider. And I think, again, I want to remind you of these folks. One of the clips I started with, where there was this kind of black militia group who was arguing that gun control laws hurt Black people more than they hurt other people. And I think what I want to do is just spend a little bit of time with this argument. Whether you agree with it or not, I do think it's just interesting to at least be exposed to it because, again, whether you're for or against gun control or somewhere in the middle, it's a complicated issue. So as we have done before, I'm going to use Adam Ruins Everything. This is basically a video kind of talking about race and gun laws. And again, Adam Ruins Everything, it has this kind of dark sense of humor, which you might find funny or not. And again, whether you are for or against gun control, I think this video will do a good job of demonstrating how these issues that seem like they have nothing to do with race oftentimes do. So check it out. As usual, I'd like you to end by reflecting. What was the most important, impactful, and or interesting point explored this class and why? Or what did you disagree with and why? And I write that in because, maybe you were listening to me giving what I think is the historically accurate interpretation of the Second Amendment. Maybe you were like bristling, like that's not it. That's fine. If you disagree with me, this is not going to hurt your grade. If you disagree with what I'm saying, I really am curious to get your thoughts. So pick one of these four. The meanings of the Second Amendment. I say meanings, right? Because obviously it's changed over time, regardless of your views. Reconstruction era disarming African Americans, the Western genre, gun control versus gun rights. Pick one of these. This is very open-ended. What do you think? What are your thoughts? What are your reactions? Post a signed response to the main Lino board, and as usual, I look forward to hearing your responses. Thank you.